welcome everyone again, all the new arrivals. So Caravaggio in Sicily in August, so if you're interested in Caravaggio, make note of that date. And then in early December, probably within the first Sunday in December, we're not quite sure yet. You will find out if you subscribe to the gallery and you will receive an email about that. We're looking at the Bernini and the Baroque in Italy. So that's be a very interesting afternoon as well. So Elio has already covered this part. So for those of you that just have arrived, the first part is all about Venice, and the second part essentially is about Tintoretto and his works. So here we are. Everybody meet Tintoretto. Tintoretto is regarded to be one of the greatest of the Renaissance artists. His father was born in Lucca. Lucca is a town in Tuscany, and some people say that his father had a very unsuccessful life in Lucca and moved to Venice. Some historians actually say that it's the opposite, that he was so successful in Lucca that he decided to expand his potential for success in Venice. Tintoretto was born in 1518. We are not sure if he was born in September or October of that year, but we are certainly sure that he died in Venice on the 31st of May. So this is almost a commemorative lecture for him on the 31st of May of 1594 at the age of 75. So, where did he come from, and what was he doing? What was happening in Venice at the time of his birth, and what contributed to the success of Tintoretto over the years? Well, let's look at Venice and look at Italy at the time, in the 16th century, and a little bit before that. Okay, so how many of you have been to Italy? Put your hand up if you've been to Italy. How many of you have been to Venice? Right, so those who've been to Venice, you know where Venice is. Venice is located up there in the Veneto area. During the period following the Holy Roman Empire, the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, Italy wasn't a country as such, was a collection of city-states. And one of the most important of these were the papal states, the states that came under the direct control of the Pope. The Pope at the time wasn't just a religious figure. He was also a warrior. He was also a king, an emperor, someone who had the power to call a war and the power to establish an army, and his power was both ecclesiastical and temporal. So, I'll just go back for a second. So, around about 1487, the Pope decided that it needed a port in the access to the northern part of Italy, this part of Italy here. And he was established in Rome. There was a number of important cities along the Adriatic coast, and one of those is called Padua. I don't know if anybody has been there to Padua. Padua was a very powerful city during this period, and it was tasked to provide the Pope and the Papal States with a port. And they moved, they decided to establish that port here in this area at the mouth of the River Po, which is the longest river in Sicily. So, in Italy, I'm sorry, not in Sicily, I was thinking of something else, but in Italy. So, who lived in that area at that particular time? Well, at that particular time, there were only fishermen and salt workers who lived in what we know now as Venice. It was a collection of really sand islands, very shabby, full of malaria, ill protected from the weather. There were no mountains or hills where one could set up a settlement and getting it sort of sheltered and taken care of. There was also very little drinking water also in Venice at that time. So it was not a very sanitary place to live. And in fact, very few people lived there. During the invasion of the Huns, the barbarians from northern Europe, a lot of people had vacated the hinterland of Venice, where now we have the city of Mestre, which is the land part of Venice. Some of you who travel by train, you will know that you can get off either at Mestre or at Santa Lucia, which is right in the middle of the Venice Island city. And those people that took refuge in those islands. And here we have the crest of Venice before it became a maritime power. This is it's represented by a cross indicating that these were papal lands, and 3 dolphins representing the aquatic nature, if you like, of the city. And also, being fishers, they represented Christianity as well, right? So this is Venice before, if you like, how it wanted to be known before it became a naval republic. Well, what happened in subsequent years, once the city was established, we know that it became a major naval power in the Mediterranean. And the image that Venice adopted was that of the Lion of Venice, the Lion of San Mark. And this is because one of the Doge of Venice decided, the Doge Agnello, his surname was, took from Alexandria in Egypt what was believed to be the remains of the body of Saint Mark, and took it to Venice and made it the protecting or the patron saint of the city. And that automatically, because the saint was an Egyptian saint, because Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, if you like, it became a tie with the non-Christian, non-Catholic side of the Orthodox, if you like, element of the religious faith. So here we have this glorious banner of Venice and the protecting saint, there, Saint Mark the Evangelist. Okay, the power that Venice had was enormous. Here in this map, if we look at it, the red parts are the land territories that were possessed by, or that were under the direct control of Venice. As it expanded, Venice took more and more from the Ottoman Empire and started to trade with all these outposts. But it also, and not only land, it also created trading routes all across the Mediterranean. And this allowed an enormous amount of trade to flow through Venice. Now, in those days, it was almost impossible to reach some of these outposts by land. And so, from Venice, from Central Europe. So, the availability of ports that allowed trade, spices, cloth, all sorts of precious metals, silver, to reach the centre of Europe was a great asset for Europe and for the world, and Venice became a very powerful city and a very powerful port. So much so that during the Byzantine Empire, what we have is what the Venetians called the Stato del Mar, the Venice of the sea, right, which included all the ports, and Stato de Terra, as they say in Venetian, and Venice of the land, right? So these were two elements of the way in which Venice operated that contributed to the success and the power, economic power of Venice. Let's have a, during this period also, we have great discoveries that impacted on Venice. And these great discoveries begin in 1488 with Diaz, Bartolomeo Diaz, who rounds the southern tip of Africa for the very first time. And this is something that was not done before. And this opened up not only new routes, but a new sensitivity to the possibility of moving to new lands via sea rather than via land. In 1498, Vasco da Gama extends what Diaz does and moves on all the way to India, opening up a series of ports under the jurisdiction of Portugal, of which he was a citizen. In 1500, Cabral, using the same routes of Diaz and Gama, follows and discovers Brazil and claims it for Portugal. And in 1543, Francisco Zemoto discovers Japan. And all of a sudden, Venice, who was the only port in the Mediterranean who imported stuff from the east, was superseded by Lisbon, the port of Lisbon, because all of these explorers were in fact Portuguese, and they had committed to advance the Portugal power in the New World, what they call the New World. So that is one thing that has impacted on Venice. And the interesting thing also is that this wasn't the only thing that impacted on, in a negative sense, if you like, in Venice. We also have the birth of mass communication occurring during this period. In 1440, Gutenberg discovers the printing press. And for the first time, we have books being printed. Now, keep in mind this, it would have taken 2 years to reproduce the Bible by hand and to bind it prior to the press. With the Gutenberg and the printing press, that period of time was reduced to a matter of weeks, right? In 1490, Daniel Hopfer is the first to use etching in printmaking. And this is a very, very important thing, because what Hopfer started to do was to actually open a new channel, offer artists a new channel for getting their art known to a large number of people. And in 1513, Urs Graf produces what is considered to be the first signed and dated etching in the history of art. And the fact that it was signed indicates that by this time there was a consciousness in the artist world that the printing press was in fact a very important part of the, or an outlet for artists. Look at that beautiful etching by Hopfer of Martin Luther. It was done in 1523. Look at how beautiful and how finite it is. So we're not looking at rough work. The printing press by this time has evolved and is refined to the point where artists were actually able to really profile their work, not only to their immediate followers, but also to people all around the world, because by this time the printing press was moving books. Don't forget also that during this time we had the very first book fair in Germany, in Gutenberg. Just a little stone throw away from in the same city where Gutenberg lived. Just the very first book market. Another great influence on all of this is brought about by Andrea Palladio. Palladio is one of the major architects of the Renaissance. And he was a mathematician. He was a person who had a great interest in classical architecture and the classical period. He visited Rome and he met there a friend, a patron, a person that later became his friend, who introduced him to Roman and Greek architecture and artworks. And he became firmly convinced that that was the highest possible form of architecture. And so during this period we had the revival of what he called Vitruvian architecture, architecture based on the principle of Vitruvius. Do you know the Vitruvian man that Leonardo drew? You know, the man like this with all the triangles and you must have seen it. That, if you like, exposes the concepts of Vitruvius, mathematical concepts of Vitruvius. So Palladio started to look at buildings that had strength, utility, but above all beauty. And he revived the concept of the villa. Now, the interesting thing here is that we go from artists to architects, and it's all the same long worm, you would say, the same influence. The architect develops the villa. The villa needs to be decorated to become beautiful. And so the artists start to contribute to the whole concept of embellishments of building. And they become an intrinsic part for the development of the architecture of the time. Unfortunately, not everything was rosy during this period also. During this period, we had, in fact, from the 1100s onwards, actually, over 400 years, Europe was impacted by the plague. And the plague killed 25 million people in Europe during this period. 25 million. 1/3 of the population of Europe was killed by the plague. And almost half of the population of Venice was killed by the plague. Right? So the plague is seen as a curse from God. And people become very concerned about its impact, not only socially, but also economically. Venice is the first, probably because it does have an international port, visited by ships from all over the world, from all over the Mediterranean, really, becomes very concerned about this. Also, it is historically proven that the plague entered Europe via Venice. In vessels that carried spices from the east, and rodents that boarded with the spices. So, but Venice, in order to protect itself, establishes measures to defend the city from the plague. And, And the first thing that it does, it establishes what it's called a bill of health. It's a pass. It's a health passport. It's a document that says this person here, in this case, Marcantonio Felzer, right, is free of the plague, and he can trade. He can move around the city freely. Right? A bit like us, isn't it? The same sort of thing. The other thing that they established was the first plague hospital. And this is a photograph of the hospital that was established just on one of the islands. It's called the Lazzaretto Vecchio, the old plague hospital, because there was a new one also established later on. But in this Lazzaretto Vecchio, anyone that had the plague would be isolated from everyone else, you know. And most of the people that went to the Lazzaretto Vecchio never came back. They didn't have means by helping from a medical sense these people. So it was only the strongest who survived, who defeated the plague and survived. So Venice became, again, well known for its measures for preventing the plague, and these measures were adopted throughout Europe in time, over the next few hundred years. Now, why did we decide to put the plague in this? It's important tissue. There were many waves of the plague occurring, as I said, over 300, 400 years period. During the time of Tintoretto, there were two particular plagues that occurred, waves of the plague that occurred. In one, his master, his teacher, Titian, died of the plague. And in another one, probably his daughter Marietta died of the plague. So the plague meant a lot. It impacted Tintoretto's life a lot. And Ilya will show you ways in which he, in a sense, honoured the memory of this in paintings that he did later on in life. We also have the Reformation. The Reformation is the period of history where there is a change in Europe from believing totally that everything the Catholic Church does is good to a period of actually questioning what the Catholic Church was doing. And there were a series of protests primarily led by Martin Luther, but not only Martin Luther, there were other people in Europe that were advocating to protest against the power and the corruption of the Pope. During this time, you could buy indulgences. If you killed someone and you knew that we're going to go to hell because you killed someone, what you would do, you would go to a priest, you would go to the Pope, you would go to a bishop and say, will you please give me, if I pay so much money, will you give me an indulgence? Will you give me a pardon? And with this indulgence, I will go through the gates of paradise, right? So everybody was buying their own salvation, Now, Martin Luther and all the Calvinists, all the Calvin and lots of other people who were advocating against the power of the papacy saw this as being a total point of corruption of the church. They also went out and said that salvation is not achieved by paying, by buying pardons. That salvation is achieved through the reading of the Bible and through the study of the Bible. And so, do you remember I said to you that Gutenberg Bible became very popular, and it became even more popular during this period because everybody had access to it. So everybody could go and buy a Bible, and everybody could interpret it in their own way. So they didn't need anymore a mediator, someone like a priest or an archbishop or the Pope to tell them what the Bible was actually saying. In 1517, Luther posts on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral a document that contains 95 arguments against the papacy. And that becomes the document, the flagpole, the flag upon which the Protestants move forward in Europe, right? And the word Protestants comes exactly from this period. They were protesting. These are the people that protest. And his 95 arguments were easily adopted by other people in Europe who believed, like he did, in the corruption of the church, and a movement is created, which we call now the Protestant movement. As a result of it, Luther is declared a heretic, and he's cast off from the Catholic Church. The Pope excommunicates him. And Martin Luther says, don't worry, doesn't matter, picks up the Bible, and this time he translates it from Latin, which was the language of the wealthy, the language of the church, the language of the people that were educated, and translates it in vulgar German, the German that was spoken by everybody. Some of the Protestants in England translated in English, and the Protestants in France translated in French. And so all of a sudden, everyone can access the Bible, and not only the Bible in Latin, they can also access it in their own language. And what this does is that it creates an atmosphere, an environment in which common people identify that they can now decide on how to practice their own faith. So this is critical, absolutely critical to Europe and what was happening at the time. So the church in Rome reacts, of course reacts. It's losing thousands and thousands of people, millions of people. So what it does, it rekindles the Inquisition. The Inquisition had existed in many shapes and forms since 1184. And during this period, and went on, believe it or not, until last century. In some parts of the world. In 1184, in 1545, the church or the Pope calls a council of all the bishops, all the religious people, and they met in the city of Trento, and that is now known as the Council of Trento. And during this council, what they decided to do was to review, to understand. They did a post-mortem. They decided what's happening and why is it happening and how can we prevent people from becoming Protestants, right? And so what they did was, the first thing was, we're going to have to punish them. We're going to punish the ones that are really saying things that are outrageous, that we cannot accept. And how do we punish them? We'll send inquisitions into their cities, and these people will be then punished. And some were excommunicated, some were burned at the stake, some were killed, some were given to the law, to the legal systems of their own, of the country, to be judged. They also looked at renewing the Catholic faith, determining new ways of practicing the Catholic faith. And one of the ways they did that was by codifying the faith practice. They codified the Mass, they codified prayers, they codified a whole way in which people could express their religiosity. They also they also thought about what would happen to countries that had just been discovered. So what they did, they sent missionaries in the New World to evangelize, to spread the word of God, the Catholic word of God. They sent Franciscans and Jesuits. They sent the Jesuits in Japan, they sent Franciscans in South America. And their task was to create churches, new churches for them, always with the intent of preventing the Protestants from expanding. They also came to agree that performing acts of piety was the essential thing that saved people. So you had to be generous. You had to be generous to the poor. You had to be generous to the sick. You had to help others in every way you possibly could. And by living a righteous life, you would gain salvation. And they established universities that were run by religious orders and focused around the faith, the interpretation of the sciences according to the faith, according to the Catholic faith. Most important of all for us here today is that they promoted the adoration of saints. They identified that there were some pious people in the world in the past that deserved to be held up as example for all of us to follow. And they made them saints. They made them superior beings that had been given the blessing of God. And the saints, the promotion and adoration of saints, led directly to the establishment of the confraternity, of this association, faith association. And there were associations connected to a particular saint that helped people in need. And in particular, they associated to the saint a particular grace. So a particular saint would pray for you against illness. Another one would pray for you against financial misfortune. Another one. So, if you pray that saint or for that particular problem that you had, you would get direct help, tailored help, if you like. And so, going back to Venice, we have the there's a group of people in Venice who establish the Scuola Grande di San Rocco. Scuola in this word here, scuola, doesn't mean a school. It means a congregation. It means a group of people who believe, have a common belief. And this scuola believed in San Rocco, Saint Roch. Saint Roch is the patron saint against the plague. So do you remember how we said that in Venice we had the problem of the plague? Saint Roch protected the city from the plague. So of course they became, people would give money to the association to say masses, to pray for delivering the city from the plague. Now, the Scuola Grande was built right next to the church of San Roch, which contains the remains of the saint. So what more? This was a very powerful saint. The church next door was actually the place where he was buried, right? In this picture here, we can see how popular the feast of San Roch was in Venice. Tintoretto actually paints the feast of San Roch in 1737 and 1735. Sorry, and all the people gathered just outside the church and in front of the Scuola Grande. So this Scuola Grande, these large buildings built through charity, for charity, right, were supported by merchants, and there were plenty of them in Venice, by rich people, and by people who wanted to increase the image of the saint to which the congregation was established for. Right? So it developed over time a standard design, if you like. The buildings were standardized. There was an entry hall which was called La Sala Terra. So you came through there and you entered this hall. Then there would be a staircase, a magnificent staircase, very large staircase that led upstairs to La Sala Grande or Sala Superiore, which was used as a meeting room for all the members of the association. And in this room there was an altar on which Mass was said, consecrated. And then there was La Sala dell'Albergo, a smaller room in which the leaders of the confraternita, of the congregation, would gather, and where the bank of the congregation was held. So if the poor that needed assistance would go to this place to ask for alms and support, financial support, and for the zonta, which was the meetings of the supervisory board of the congregation. Now, there are many schools in Venice. The school of San Roch is one of the most beautiful and mostly richly decorated. But there's a school of San Marco, there's plenty of other places similar to this that contain works of art by artists of the time that were hired to embellish the building. This is some pictures of and paintings of San Roch. This is the ground hall, the ground floor hall. This is the hall upstairs. Fantastic, isn't it? Beautiful. And these are two very important paintings that we find there, the crucifixion and the painting of Saint Roch, here he is, in glory, moving towards paradise, right? Both these paintings are by Tintoretto, and Ilya will talk more about that. And just before we leave, I want to leave you with just some idea of who Tintoretto really was. First of all, he was a man who loved the arts, enormously. He played music. He played the flute. He sang. He built sets for plays. He decorated theatres. He didn't just paint. Throughout his life, he devoted himself to art in all of its forms. He, as a young man, he attended the workshop of Titian, and Ilya will talk to you more about his interaction with Titian. But overall, although he lived a very sheltered life in a sense, he focused his existence on living poorly, partly because of his pious nature, but also because he was a recluse by nature. He loved to be on his own, he surrounded himself with the casts of great sculptures and great works that he, by great masters that he admired, particularly Michelangelo. And again, Ilya will tell you more about his relationship with Michelangelo. But there's the casts, Michelangelo's casts, actually were his companions for the rest of his life. He would not allow anybody to go in his studio. He would spend hours locked in there, surrounded by his casts and studying them and being inspired by them. In 1560, he married Faustina de Vescovi. She was a noblewoman, and she was the daughter of the head of the congregation of San Marco, of the Confraternita of San Marco, another major school in Venice. And her father had become a patron of Tintoretto, and they lived quite unusual for the time. It was a marriage of love, and they lived together very happily until his death. They had 8 children, of which 4 lived to middle age, and one of the children that survived Tintoretto was his son Domenico, who took over his workshop. Tintoretto also had an illegitimate daughter, Marietta Robusti. She herself was a great artist. She was well known for her portraits. She was also a musician, and she was a singer. And he had a particular love and affection for Marietta. Marietta died possibly of the plague, and her death greatly impacted Tintoretto. But Marietta, Domenico, and his other children, his other surviving children, helped him work on his painting. They were apprentices. Tintoretto had very few apprentices. He was very secretive about the way he worked and his style of work. So he shared very little with other people. In 1592, he was prominent enough and wealthy enough to become a member of the Scuola dei Mercanti, the school of the merchants. And although he hardly ever travelled out of Venice, I think there's 2 instances only recorded where he left Venice. One was to go to Mantua, which is not that far from Venice, right? For the day. possibly, we think, he went to Rome for a short period of time, and that's where he saw the works of Michelangelo. But the rest of his time, he lived in Venice. And all that time, he lived in the area where he was born, the Sestriere of Canareggio, an area of Venice that you can actually see if you're coming from the airport on a private taxi, water taxi. You can actually see Canareggio on your right hand side. He had a very reserved character. There's indication that he liked conversation, but people say he never smiled. They never saw him smile. But he was very a great companion to have around, to share information with. And he became friends of many of the great thinkers of the time, who were flocking to Venice and going and admiring his work and the works of other Venetian painters. So they came into Venice. He never went out to meet them. They came in and sought him out. This is the house of Tintoretto. He moved in here in 1574, and it's still there. You can go and visit it. It is on the Fondamenta dei Mori in Canareggio, and you can see this is a new home, so don't consider that it's relatively recent. But the whole area would have had houses similar to this, and merchants and people of quite a good financial position lived in places like this. This is where he lived with his wife, Faustina, and his 8 children. And this is his tomb, which you find in the Madonna dell'Orto church, just around the corner from his house. He never went far, not even in there. And he had buried his daughter and his son in this church. His explicit desire was to be buried with his daughter, and he, in fact, is buried in the same grave as his daughter. Here. This is the church where all of his children were baptized. And one of the works that he left for that church is a beautiful work on wood, and which were big panel doors for the organ, for the great organ of the church. His theatricality, his love for theatre is shown in this work, because when it was open, it would show a particular picture, and when it was closed, it would show a different picture. So, the sense of theatricality, the sense of beauty was in him all the time, and he was finding different ways of expressing it to his love. The doors have been dismantled now, and they are now exhibited as 3 panels, independent panels, that make up a triptych. And this is Tintoretto in his portrait at the age of 75. A sad old man, we would say, just by looking at him. A man, like people said, smiled seldomly. He's looking directly at us. And I don't know, each one of us will take his message with us. Perhaps even more after Elio talks to you about it, and we'll find out more about it. Oops, sorry. This statement here, il disegno di Michelangelo e il colorito di Tiziano, the design of Michelangelo and the color of Titian, his artistic testament. That's what he wrote on the wall of his studio for his children who assisted him in his work, and for anyone else that would follow after his death. That's what he truly believed in. And with this statement, I'll leave you. I thank you for your attention. And I look forward to seeing you back in about 5 minutes or so. Get a drink, nibble, sit down within 5 minutes. Ilya will start, and we'll go into a journey deep into his pictures to really find out who he was and why did he occupy such an important place in the history of Renaissance Italy. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sitting through the first part. Grab yourself a drink, look at the lovely paintings, we'll switch on the lights in a moment. The artist is here, Basil at the back if you'd like to speak to Basil about the work that's on show. And we'll reconvene in about 5 to 10 minutes to do the second part. And take it off to there. Okay, thank you.
Get here.